as I was just telling Nathan, this takes me back a little bit. When we moved to Yale in 2000, the school was being remodeled. And so the first time I taught the Old Testament introduction at Yale was in the chapel. And I think that was probably the last time I have lectured in a chapel. In the later years of my teaching at Yale Divinity School, I devoted a lot of my time to the subject of biblical values. One doesn't or shouldn't read the Bible to learn science or cosmology, and while one can learn history from it, its treatment of history is often cavalier. It's not written for the purpose of conveying historical information, not primarily. The main reason people read the Bible, I would think, is for guidance in ethical living. And even on that topic, it is not without its problems, but it has much to offer. If one teaches the Old Testament, as I did, one cannot fail to be impressed by the insistent demand for justice, especially in the Hebrew prophets. No other literature that has come down to us from antiquity matches the passion of the Bible on that issue. And yet, in the public discourse of 21st century America, many of the people who most loudly proclaim themselves to be Bible Christians do not seem to attach a high priority to questions of justice at all. The Hebrew Bible follows an understanding of justice that was common throughout the ancient Near East, that the strong should not oppress the weak. That ideal was proclaimed by King Hammurabi of Babylon centuries before Moses, and affirmed in principle by kings and rulers, whether they try to abide by it or not. The underlying concern for the most vulnerable members of society is typically expressed in the modern world in terms of human rights. In view of the biblical commitment to justice, I began my study of this subject, confident that the Bible would resoundingly support human rights. But if there is one thing I have learned over the years, it is that the Bible doesn't always say what people expect it to say, or indeed assume that it says. In fact, the Bible does not have a discourse of human rights, and does not affirm some of the rights that are commonly assumed. It remains a powerful advocate for the weak of society, but its attitude to human rights is more complicated than I had expected. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights, according to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights issued by the United Nations in 1948. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act toward one another in a spirit of brotherhood. Consequently, it claims that everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of person, regardless of race, color, sex, or any other distinguishing feature. This declaration is arguably the most authoritative and widely accepted framework for ethics in the modern world, even if it is often ignored in practice. The Declaration clearly echoes two famous proclamations from the Age of Enlightenment. The American Declaration of Independence, authored by Thomas Jefferson, declared, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." The French Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen in the time of the Revolution in 1789 claimed that men are born and remain free and equal in rights. These rights were specified as liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. The French Declaration helpfully explained what it meant by liberty. Liberty consists in the ability to do whatever does not harm another. Hence, the exercise of the natural rights of each man has no other limits than those which assure to other members of society the enjoyment of the same rights. The intertextual links between these documents strongly suggest that the modern idea of human rights as formulated by the United Nations, had its birth in the 18th century in the Age of Enlightenment. There were, of course, earlier precedents of human rights, and there is an extensive debate as to the origin of the idea. Thomas Hobbes had written of the right of nature as the liberty each man hath to use his own power as he will himself for the preservation of his own nature, that is to say, his own life, and consequently of doing anything which in his judgment and reason he shall conceive to be the aptest means thereunto. Scholars have proposed various genealogies of the idea, tracing it to Stoic cosmopolitanism, Roman jura, which are usually property rights, medieval concepts of natural law, or the practice of canon law. René Cassin, who received the Nobel Peace Prize for his work in drafting the UN Declaration of Human Rights and was himself Jewish, claimed that the concept of human rights comes from the Bible, from the Old Testament, from the Ten Commandments. The case for biblical origins has been taken up by others, notably by Nick Walterstorff, my former colleague at Yale, in his fine study, Justice, Rights and Wrongs. It remains controversial, however, and the import of the Bible remains ambiguous. As Walter Harrelson has noted, every breakthrough toward human liberation in Western society has been both affirmed and denounced on the basis of appeals to biblical religion, biblical thought, and biblical practice. Various specific local rights have been recognized throughout history, but not all qualify as human rights in the sense proclaimed by the United Nations. The historian Lynn Hunt has argued that human rights require three interlocking qualities. Rights must be natural, inherent in human beings, equal, the same for everyone, and universal, applicable everywhere. For rights to be human rights, all humans everywhere in the world must possess them equally and only because of their status as human beings. As Walterstorff puts it, a human right is a right such that the only status one needs in order to possess the right, the only credential required, is that of being a human being. Local rights, such as those proclaimed in the English Magna Carta or the Bill of Rights of 1689, which affirm the right of a certain class of people or of people in a particular society, do not qualify as human rights. Moreover, we may distinguish between the inherent rights that are intrinsic to being human and rights that are conferred and guaranteed by a state. Whether, in fact, it makes sense to speak of human rights that are independent of any human institution has always been controversial. In practice, if rights are to be recognized and enforced, they require the backing of some institution. The British utilitarian philosopher Jeremy Bentham, a contemporary of Jefferson, famously declared that the concept of natural rights was nonsense on stilts. In our own century, the late Alistair MacIntyre equated belief in human rights with belief in witches and unicorns and declared that human rights are fictions. Despite the ringing claim of Thomas Jefferson, the claim that all men are created equal has not been self-evident for most of human history, and I would say is not self-evident to everyone today. Even those who profess it in principle are often blind to its implications. Jefferson himself was a slave owner. Women were not allowed to vote in the United States for more than a century after the Declaration of Independence. Governments, notably that of the United States, often appeal to human rights selectively in a way that aligns with broader political interests, and this too has tended to discredit the idea. The fact that an idea is misused or used only selectively does not invalidate it in principle, but the fact that many people are skeptical of the idea of human rights should lead us to pause to consider their foundation. In fact, the 18th century declarations posit two quite different foundations for human rights. The American Declaration of Independence invoked the Creator as the guarantor of human rights. All men, presumably all human beings, are created equal and endowed by their Creator with inalienable rights. This formulation is obviously congenial to Christian and Jewish tradition and is echoed, for example, in the encyclical of Pope John XXIII, Pacem in Terris, which declares that God created man in his own image and likeness, endowed him with intelligence and freedom, and made him Lord of creation. According to the encyclical, the laws that govern humanity are inscribed in human nature. It goes on to affirm a long list of rights, beginning with the right to live and to be respected. The view that rights are given by the Creator is also congenial to the view that justice is conformity to an objective right order, whether that order was established by a creator or not. Plato, in his Republic, envisioned a society with differentiated roles. People are better fitted for some roles than for others. Some people are naturally suited to be rulers, others naturally suited to be servants. Plato didn't speak of rights in this regard, but modern right order theorists grant that rights are conferred on people within such a society. The rights, however, derive from the transcendent order and depend on the appropriate roles. If you're naturally designed to be a servant, you have no right to rule. Such a view of right order allows for moral absolutes established by the Creator, independent of human aspirations and desires. Natural law in the Catholic tradition is the law implanted in nature by the Creator and not something that humans can modify. So, for example, Pope John Paul II, in his 1993 Encyclopedia on Moral Theology, which he called The Splendor of Truth, affirmed the universality and permanent validity of the natural law. In contrast, the French Declaration on the Rights of Man and Citizen and the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights do not mention God at all. According to the French Declaration, the only limiting factor in human rights is that they must not infringe on the rights of others. In that framework, rights have to do with human desire and fulfillment, rather than with conformity to a transcendent order. As one can see by comparing the American and French declarations, one can arrive at many of the same rights on either approach, but this is not necessarily always the case. As we will see, a supposedly transcendent right order does not always affirm or correspond to human needs or desires, and some rights that are claimed by modern humanists are denied by people who believe that there is an objective order of what is right. All the great declarations of human rights were aspirational, even utopian documents, not reflections of political reality. They were assertions of what should be the case, not necessarily of not what was actually the case. The same might be said of the biblical laws, which were proposals rather than descriptions of actual society. If it were truly self-evident that all men are created equal, there would have been no need for a declaration to that effect. To say that all human beings have equal rights does not mean that all are recognized to have equal rights, but it is a claim that they should be so recognized. Now, Rene Cassin, who affirmed that the idea of human rights derives from the Bible, was aware that the Bible does not speak explicitly of human rights. Rather, he wrote, these principles were often phrased in terms of duties that now presume rights. For instance, said Cassin, thou shalt not murder is the right to life. Thou shalt not steal is the right to own property, and so forth. But as James Barr, notably a Serbic Scottish scholar, pointed out, to be commanded not to kill is a very different thing from saying that you have a right not to be killed. What the commandment forbids is not killing. And, thou shalt not kill is actually a mistranslation. It should be, thou shalt not murder. Murder is killing that is not permitted, but it doesn't exclude the possibility that some killing may be permitted. It's unauthorized killing. As Walter Harrelson argued that the commandment is not concerned with what is to happen in the case of violation of the prohibition, but is designed to protect without qualification the life of human beings and makes human life sacrosanct. But the laws that follow the Ten Commandments in the Pentateuch, if you read on, repeatedly prescribes the death penalty for violations. So the claim that the prohibition of murder makes life sacrosanct without qualification cannot be maintained. The Ten Commandments are often viewed as timeless ethical maxims and distinguished as such from the case laws that follow. David Kleins, a biblical scholar from New Zealand who spent most of his career in England, questioned that assumption in a probing essay, asking whose interests the Ten Commandments serve. His answer was, married male Israelite property owners. Women are not addressed. Needless to say, neither are slaves. The vested interest of the male property class are clear in the commandment against adultery, conceived as sexual relations with another man's wife, and especially in the commandment against coveting. You shall not covet your neighbor's house, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife, nor his male or female slave, or ox, or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's ass, so to speak. The commandments are not conceived as an expression of putative rights of all people, simply in virtue of being human. Biblical laws are theocentric. They assume an authority external to humanity, which must be obeyed. As such, they can easily be reconciled with natural law on the assumption that that law was embedded in nature by the Creator and with the views of justice as right order. Human rights as formulated in the French Declaration and in the United Nations Declaration are anthropocentric, grounded in the nature and needs of the human person. As David Novak, a Jewish scholar in Toronto, put it, the difference between the modern idea of human rights and the ancient idea of divine law, whether revealed or natural, is that the law is concerned with duty, what one owes to a higher authority, whereas rights are what one human being may justifiably claim from another human being with whom one is more or less equal. To quote Barr again, human rights appear to be largely predicated on the value of freedom. The person has the right to freedom in general, including freedom of movement, freedom of thought, conscience and religion, freedom of association. Rights limited only by the need to avoid encroachment on the rights and freedom of others. Even when the commandments have the effect of defending what might now be conceived as rights, by restraining murder or theft, the understanding and motivation are essentially different. The theocentric nature of biblical law is not the only problem with the argument that the concept of human rights comes from the Bible. There is also the problem of universality. Human rights should apply to all human beings, simply qua human beings. In many cases, biblical laws, even when they may be thought to entail rights, are restricted in their application. Hebrew slaves should be released after 6 years, but there is no restriction on how long you can hold Gentile slaves. Leviticus 25 advances to the point of prohibiting the enslavement of Israelites, but adds, from the nations around you, you may acquire male and female slaves. You may also acquire them from aliens residing among you, and they may be your property. Israelites should not charge interest on loans to other Israelites, but could charge it on loans to foreigners. And of course, some non-Israelite inhabitants of the land should be utterly destroyed. The idea of divine election, of one people chosen by God above all others, is difficult to reconcile with human rights. In view of these considerations, it is clear that the Bible does not frame its moral teaching as a matter of human rights. This does not preclude the possibility that ideas attested in the Bible contributed to the eventual emergence of human rights. The Bible is not a systematic document. There are counter-traditions and minority reports, and some ideas that would take on new significance in new historical contexts. A few ideas that are prominent in the Bible are especially noteworthy in this regard, and that's what I will talk about for the rest of this lecture. These include the idea that human beings are made in the image of God, the critique of kingship in Deuteronomy and the Hebrew prophets, and the view of an eschatological utopia in the New Testament. First, then, the image of God. One of the primary considerations for those who support human rights is that human beings have intrinsic worth, simply in virtue of being human. The United Nations Universal Declaration begins, whereas recognition of the inherent dignity and equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. And similarly, Pope John the 23rd, any human society, if it is to be well-ordered and productive, must lay down as a foundation of this principle that every human being is a person, that his nature is endowed with intelligence and free will, and because he is a person, he has rights and obligations flowing directly from his very nature. And these rights and obligations are universal and inviolable, so they cannot in any way be surrendered. Turning then to the Bible, Walter Storff formulates the issue: is there any indication that Israel's writers thought of human beings as having worth? Less worth than God, of course, but nonetheless worth, and that they thought of that worth as grounding rights. Now, it is easy enough to find passages in the Bible that affirm human worth. Psalm 8 proclaims in the modernized translation of the NRSV, "You have made them a little lower than God and crowned them with glory and honor. You have given them dominion over the work of your hands, and you have put all things under their feet." The psalm patently echoes the account of creation in Genesis 1, but without citing explicitly the most famous affirmation of human worth. So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Images or statues of gods played a critical role in Near Eastern cults, especially in Mesopotamia. In the words of Randall Garr, the statue is the vehicle through which a god resides in the community, maintains a presence, receives worship and prayer, and can actively participate in the society. The image could also take the form of a human being, sometimes a priest, but more often the king. The king of Babylon is told, "O king of the world, you are the image of Marduk." Or again, the king, the lord of the world, is the very image of Shamash, the sun god. The Assyrian king Tukulti-Ninurta is said to be the eternal image of Enlil. The biblical declaration, which is part of the priestly source in the Pentateuch, declaring that humankind, rather than just the king or the priest, is made in the image of God, is indeed a remarkable elevation of the status of ordinary human beings, male and female alike. Does it entail rights? Walter Sruff points to Genesis chapter 9, verse 6, when God is speaking to Noah after the flood. Whoever sheds the blood of a human, by a human shall that person's blood be shed. For in his own image, God made humankind. He notes correctly that the prohibition against murder is grounded not in God's law, but in the worth of the human being. All who bear God's image, writes Walter Sruff, possess on that account an inherent right not to be murdered. But they evidently do not possess a right to life, since the murderer, no less than the victim, is presumably made in the image of God, and the penalty for his action is death. Whoever sheds the blood of a human being, by a human being shall his blood be shed. The fact that something is prohibited in the interest of social order, or even because of the intrinsic worth of the individual, is not tantamount to a right for all human beings. But that said, nonetheless, the idea that human beings are made in the image of God is significant, and is significant in establishing a foundation for some concept of human rights. As the day goes on, you will see where I am going with my principle of biblical theology, if you like, of how you can use a biblical text that isn't quite saying what we wanted to say. But we can talk about that later on. The designation of humanity rather than the king as the image of God had political implications, insofar as it undercut the special status of the king. Both the American Declaration of Independence and the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen were also formulated in the context of protest against abuses of royal power. The royal ideology of Judah declared the king to be Son of God, or even simply a god in Psalm 45, clearly exalted above other human beings. This ideology is amply attested in the Psalms and occasionally reflected in the prophets. But the Pentateuch, or Torah, is largely silent about kingship, except for the law of the king in Deuteronomy 17. Those of you who have had an introduction to the Old Testament, and I should hope that you all have had such an introduction, and guided by a good textbook on the subject, will know that Deuteronomy was modeled on Assyrian vassal treaties, which Assyrian kings made with subject peoples. Treaties typically spell out the obligations of the subjects and the consequences of obedience or disobedience. Subjects are even on occasion commanded to love their Assyrian overlord and show him unconditional loyalty. Deuteronomy claims for the God of Israel the kind of allegiance demanded by the Assyrian king from his subject peoples. The German scholar Eckhart Otto has argued at length that the adaptation of Assyrian vassal treaties in the Deuteronomic Covenant intended to deprive the Assyrian king of his claim to the loyalty of the Judean king and people. Absolute loyalty was due only to Yahweh. Moreover, he claims the cultural historical importance of this process cannot be overestimated. The Judean intellectuals who were responsible for the transformation of this Assyrian political theology into an anti-imperialistic set of theological ideas did not only negate the Assyrian version of the royal ideology, the idea of a state with absolute power, but indirectly and implicitly also negated the Judean royal ideology as it was promulgated in some Psalms. So he argues there are two interrelated sources for the idea of human rights in the Hebrew Bible: the qualification of monarchy that originated in Deuteronomy and the idea of the image of God in the biblical creation theology. Otto argues that for the idea of man's freedom from any absolute claim of political power, it was a necessary step to think of an absolute loyalty of man to God. And he understands human rights as a matter of the rights of the individual against the encroachment of the state. He also credits the social laws of Deuteronomy, such as the revision of the laws about debt and slavery in Deuteronomy, with an important impact on the conceptualization of these fields of human rights. In a similar vein, Joshua Berman argues that in the biblical adaptation of ancient Near Eastern treaties, the common man of Israel takes on aspects of the subordinate king. He finds an egalitarian impulse in the warp and woof of the Pentateuch, typified by the story of the Exodus, which affirms that the people of Israel originated as slaves. Even when Deuteronomy provides for a king, his power is severely curtailed. Bernard Levinson has argued cogently that the law of the king introduces the idea of a constitutional monarchy insofar as the king is made subject to the law, a principle which, as we know, is still in dispute. The egalitarian impulse in the Pentateuch undoubtedly had influence on the conceptualization of human rights in modern times, but the society envisioned in Deuteronomy is nonetheless far from egalitarian and remote from modern conceptions of human rights. Despite the memory of the Exodus, the institution of slavery is unchallenged, even if the limitation of the enslavement of Israelites was extended to women. Only limited protection is provided for women in the case of rape. Women receive little recognition otherwise, and non-Israelite people are excluded from the world of moral concern, in the phrase of Michael Walzer. Even for Israelites, the book advances what Juhapakala called intolerant monolatry, calling for zero tolerance of family members who worship gods other than Yahweh. Just as the Assyrians showed zero tolerance for people who were loyal to a different king. This is not to deny that the vision of Deuteronomy is progressive in its time in some respects, especially regarding the treatment of the poor. We must bear in mind that the American Declaration of Independence, too, accepted slavery and limited the rights of women, despite the declaration that all men were created equal. We can appreciate the contribution of the biblical tradition without resorting to hyperbolic anachronism. A more promising anticipation of human rights can be found in at least some of the prophets, primarily in the matter of social and economic justice. When Amos complains about buying the poor for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals, the basis for the complaint would seem to be the inherent worth of the poor as human beings. His concern was not just for the Israelite poor. In the Oracles Against the Nations, in the opening chapters of the book, he invokes punishment of Moab because he burned to lime the bones of the king of Edom. As John Barton commented, a striking feature of the war crimes condemned in Amos 1 and 2 is that they seem to be matter of conventional morality. There is nothing about such matters in Israelite law codes, and in any case, the offenses have been committed by foreigners who do not know the law of Israel, and in at least one case, do not even have Israel as their victim. One of the distinctive features of Amos is his denial that Israel has any special status in the eyes of God. Are you not like the Ethiopians to me, O people of Israel, says the Lord? Did I not bring Israel up from the land of Egypt, and the Philistines from Caphtor, and the Arameans from Kir? Accordingly, there are some indignities to which no human being should be subjected, including sale into slavery and desecration of the dead. Amos, of course, did not have a systematic view of human rights. He expresses spontaneous outrage at certain abuses. We do not know whether he condemned all forms of slavery, but he has nothing to say on the status of women. But at least he is concerned with humanity as such, and in this he differs from most of the biblical laws. A similar concern with humanity, regardless of ethnic or religious differences, is characteristic of the wisdom literature. As Job says of his slaves, "Did not he who made me in the womb make them? And did not one fashion us in the womb?" Empathy with the common lot of humanity is fundamental to the idea of intrinsic human rights, even if it isn't always developed to that end. The prophetic demand for justice can be seen in the context of the common ancient Near Eastern concept of justice, that the strong should not oppress the weak. Nathan's parable in 2 Samuel 11 and the story of Naboth's vineyard in 1 Kings 21 are classic protests against the abuse of royal power. No other body of literature from antiquity is so insistent on social justice. Hebrew tradition remembered a time when there was no king in Israel, and the biblical writings were compiled after the demise of the monarchy. The collection as a whole is less deferential to kings and rulers than other writings that have come down to us from antiquity. Outrage at abuse of power is certainly an important ingredient in the development of concepts of human rights, although again, it falls well short of modern conceptions. Perhaps the biblical passage that carries greatest resonance for the modern discussion of human rights is the pronouncement of Paul that there is no longer Jew or Greek, there is no longer slave or free, there is no longer male and female, for all of you are one in Christ Jesus. This sentence is thought to be pre-Pauline in origin, part of a baptismal liturgy. It is a bold claim that negates distinctions that were fundamental to ancient society. David Awney writes, "This is quite an astonishing conception that seems to abolish in principle all inequities based on nationality, social status, and gender." Hans-Dieter Betz adds that it is significant that Paul makes these statements not as utopian ideals or as ethical demands, but as an accomplished fact. The question is, therefore, how the present tense of the phrase, "you are," is to be understood. It is apparent, however, from Paul's other letters that social differentiation had not been abolished. Paul still thought that women should cover their heads when they prophesied and that men should not. He did not call for the emancipation of slaves. On the contrary, he argued that people should stay in the state in which they were called and not called social upheaval, for this world was passing away. Were you a slave when called? Do not be concerned about it. Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be set free. Are you free of a wife? And notice the way he puts it. It doesn't sound very attractive. Are you free of a wife? Do not seek a wife. The appointed time has grown short, for the present form of this world is passing away. Taken literally, the abolition of social distinctions would have been revolutionary, and undoubtedly it would have met with violent repression. Paul did not call for revolution. His point seems to have been that these distinctions are no longer mattered, that they would soon pass away in any case. The declaration was highly progressive, since it meant that Greeks, slaves, and women were all welcome in the Christian community. Nonetheless, it did not abolish the hierarchical distinctions between male and female or slave and free, and these distinctions were reaffirmed very quickly, as we can see from the household codes in later epistles. Whatever Paul meant by his use of the present tense, the abolition of distinctions in Galatians 3:28 remains a utopian ideal. Karen Neutel, a Dutch scholar, in her study of the verse as a utopian ideal, acknowledges that it does not proclaim the equality of all people regardless of their social positions, as is sometimes assumed by readers today. Rather, she argues, Paul draws implications from his eschatological perspective, but does not suggest that this already erases the world as it is. It rather describes a new creation, a reality that is not yet entirely present. It is suggestive, nonetheless, as an affirmation of an ideal, and as such, it has no doubt contributed to the eventual development of a concept of universal human rights. In each of these cases, then, we find a basis in the biblical tradition for treating our fellow human beings with respect and being concerned for their welfare. The Bible places the emphasis on the obligation to care for others rather than on the assertion of rights. Is this distinction significant? I'll return to that later in the day. But we must also note that the range of concern for our fellow human being does not align perfectly with the rights claimed in the modern Declaration of Human Rights. In my second lecture, I will focus on the major rights claimed in these declarations, the rights to life and liberty, and also take up the question of women's rights. We will find that the Bible has positive things to say about each of these, but also much that is problematic. The Bible, after all, was written long ago and in a faraway country and culture, and we should not be surprised that it does not always align itself with modern sensibilities.